My name is Sienna, and I am 33 years old. On the day of our $150,000 wedding reception, my husband grabbed the microphone and proudly presented his secret family to 200 elite guests. He stood next to my adopted stepsister, who was wearing a white wedding gown and cradling newborn twins, and he loudly demanded a divorce so he could claim his true heirs. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly signed the papers and watched him eagerly walk into a trap that would leave him financially and socially ruined. When he later brought her home to brag, his mother froze, stared at the babies, and whispered a devastating medical secret that shattered his entire reality. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you love seeing a traitor get exactly what they deserve. The harsh screech of the microphone suddenly cut through the elegant string quartet playing in the botanical garden estate. I stood at the altar in my custom silk gown, surrounded by towering walls of imported white orchids. 200 of my key investors, hospital board members, and high society family members sat quietly in their velvet chairs. Jason, my husband of 3 years, on paper was supposed to read his heartfelt vows. We had legally married years ago, solely so he could use my premium health insurance after he lost his middle management job. But my parents fiercely demanded this massive public ceremony to perfectly maintain their flawless country club image. I paid for the entire extravagant event myself. I was simply waiting for the ceremony to quickly transition to the cocktail hour so I could network with my venture capitalists. Jason did not look at me. He gripped the microphone tightly, his chest puffed out with a sickening arrogance that I had never seen before. He loudly declared into the microphone that he could not live a toxic lie anymore. The murmurs in the crowd instantly died. Everyone froze in place, genuinely thinking it was some kind of strange and poorly timed joke. But Jason kept his face dead serious. He raised his free hand and pointed directly toward the heavy oak double doors at the back of the luxurious hall. He proudly announced that he desperately deserved a real family, and a woman who actually knew how to genuinely love him. The heavy oak doors slowly swung open. A collective gasp rippled through the 200 elite guests, echoing sharply against the glass walls of the venue. Standing perfectly framed in the doorway was Brittany, my 29-year-old adopted stepsister. She wore a floor-length white lace gown that looked intentionally designed to rival my own expensive wedding dress. But that was not what made the wealthy investors and snobby family members drop their jaws in absolute shock. In her arms, she carefully held 2 small bundles wrapped in pale yellow hospital blankets. They were newborn twins. Jason confidently walked right past me, leaving me entirely abandoned at the beautiful altar, and marched straight down the long aisle to meet her. He wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, kissed her forehead dramatically for every single person to see, and turned back to face the stunned crowd. "Brittany is my true soulmate," he declared proudly, holding the microphone close to his mouth so nobody would miss a single agonizing word. "We have been deeply in love for a long time, and these 2 beautiful children are my blood, my legacy, and the only future I care about." The silence that followed his words was absolute and incredibly heavy. You could clearly hear the evening breeze rustling the leaves outside the massive glass venue. I stood at the altar completely alone, my face perfectly neutral, analyzing the entire situation with the same cold precision I used in intense boardroom negotiations. Jason foolishly expected me to break down entirely. He fully expected me to fall to my knees, sob uncontrollably, and beg him for an explanation, effectively ruining my professional reputation in front of my important investors. Instead, I stood tall, clasped my hands quietly together, and waited patiently for his next foolish move. I knew exactly who he was, and I knew exactly what he was trying to do. He thought this grand public humiliation would deeply break me and secure his stolen wealth. He thought he had finally won the ultimate prize today. He had absolutely no idea that his fragile little empire was built on massive lies, and I was holding the match that would burn it all completely to the ground without any hesitation whatsoever. Now the real show could finally begin for everyone to clearly see. Brittany stepped forward, gracefully, gently shifting the sleeping infants in her arms so the audience could clearly see their small faces. She reached out and took the microphone directly from Jason. Her bottom lip trembled perfectly, and heavy tears pooled in her wide, innocent eyes. It was a masterful performance worthy of a cinematic award, perfectly honed by years of manipulating our parents into giving her absolutely everything she ever wanted. Sienna, I am so incredibly sorry to do this to you today. Brittany spoke into the microphone, her voice shaking with calculated vulnerability for the entire crowd to hear. But we simply could not keep hiding the truth from everyone any longer. You are a successful healthcare tech CEO. You are undeniably brilliant, but your heart is made of solid ice. You only care about your complex algorithms, your endless venture capital meetings, and your quarterly profit margins. Jason was starving for genuine affection in this empty marriage. He desperately needed a warm, nurturing woman to build a real home with something you could never possibly be for him. You were never going to give him children. You were never going to put his emotional needs first before work. I stepped in because he was drowning in your endless coldness and severe neglect. Her harsh words echoed through the silent botanical garden, bouncing off the expensive floral arrangements. She was actively weaponizing my professional success, twisting my 10 years of grueling hard work into a massive character flaw. While she spent her 20s racking up massive credit card debt and playing the perpetual victim, I was busy building an $8 million company entirely from the ground up. My parents always praised her for being soft and delicate, while they openly called me overly calculating and deeply unfeeling always. Now she was using that exact same toxic family narrative to publicly justify stealing my husband on our wedding day. The crowd began to murmur in low voices. Some of the older, more traditional family members actually looked at Brittany with sympathetic expressions, completely buying into her flawless victim act. Jason confidently took the microphone back, nodding solemnly in agreement with her highly manipulative words. He looked back at me, his eyes filled with a toxic, swirling mix of arrogant triumph and dark malice. He honestly thought he had completely destroyed my carefully cultivated public image and pristine reputation forever. He thought he had backed me into an inescapable corner. Leaving me standing humiliated at the altar was clearly not enough for his fragile ego. He actively wanted to strip me of my dignity and my hard-earned assets in one swift, devastating motion. He let go of Brittany and marched purposefully back down the aisle toward me. Reaching deep into the inside pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket, he pulled out a thick stack of folded legal papers. He marched up the front steps and slapped them down heavily onto the small wooden podium where the officiant was standing. "These are divorce papers," Jason announced loudly, his voice instantly dropping the fake sympathetic tone and turning remarkably sharp and incredibly demanding. "I had my personal lawyer draft them up early this morning. I am not spending another single day pretending to be your corporate accessory. I want to legitimize my new family immediately today. My kids deserve a dedicated father who is legally free to claim them and provide for them." He pulled a cheap plastic pen from his inner pocket and tossed it aggressively onto the papers. It rolled slowly and stopped right near my right hand quietly. "Sign it, Sienna," Jason demanded firmly, leaning in dangerously close so only I could see the greedy, desperate glint shining brightly in his dark eyes. "Sign it right now. You do not want to drag this out in a messy public court battle and have all your precious investors read about your failed, pathetic marriage in the business press. Give me exactly what I am entitled to, and I will walk away quietly with my true family." He was blatantly trying to leverage my professional pride against me. He incorrectly assumed that I would be so completely mortified by this massive public spectacle that I would blindly sign whatever document he put in front of me just to quickly make him leave the venue. He falsely assumed that because we had been legally married for 3 years, he was automatically entitled to half of my $8 million company and half of the luxury mansion we lived in. He thought those papers were his winning lottery ticket to endless wealth. I looked down at the legal divorce document. I felt absolutely no heartbreak. I picked up the cheap pen, smiled coldly, and prepared to legally destroy his entire pathetic life. I held the cheap plastic pen between my fingers, carefully examining its flimsy casing for a brief second, before casually tossing it off the far side of the wooden podium to the floor. The faint clatter loudly echoed in the dead silent room. I reached into the hidden inner pocket of my custom silk gown and proudly pulled out my personal silver Mont Blanc pen, a meaningful gift to myself when my healthcare tech company finally hit its first million in revenue. I slowly unscrewed the cap. I looked up at Jason and offered him a genuine chilling smile. It was not a smile of sorrow or masked pain. It was the cold smile of a predator watching its prey blindly walk straight into an inescapable iron trap. He blinked, clearly entirely unnerved by my complete lack of emotional breakdown. He shifted his weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other. He had heavily anticipated a massive screaming match. He had braced himself for me to launch into a desperate sobbing plea for him to stay. He wanted to look like the strong, decisive man walking away from a frantic, emotionally unstable woman. Instead, I simply smoothed out the thick pages of the legal document he had presented to me. I did not bother reading through his poorly drafted demands. I already knew exactly how amateur his personal lawyer was. With fluid, graceful motions, I signed my name on the designated dotted lines. First page, second page, third page. I did not shed a single tear. My hand did not shake even a fraction of an inch. When I reached the final signature line, I pressed the nib of my silver pen firmly against the expensive paper, leaving a bold, undeniable mark. I screwed the cap back onto my pen, slid it back into my pocket, and pushed the freshly signed divorce papers across the podium directly toward his chest. Jason stared at the signed documents in absolute disbelief. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked back at Brittany, who was standing a few feet away, with the newborn twins, expecting her to validate his deep confusion. She looked equally thrown off. They had spent weeks, possibly months, meticulously plotting this grand theatrical betrayal, heavily banking on my predictable corporate outrage. By refusing to give them the dramatic reaction they so desperately craved, I had instantly derailed their entire power trip. But Jason was far too arrogant to let his confusion show for more than a few fleeting seconds. He desperately needed to reassert his dominance in front of the 200 wealthy guests who were currently staring holes into his back. He quickly snatched the signed divorce papers off the wooden podium and shoved them violently back into his tailored tuxedo jacket. He puffed his chest out again, jutting his chin forward as a smug, entitled grin spread across his face. "Well, I am glad you decided to finally be reasonable for once in your life," Jason announced loudly into the microphone, making sure every single person in the venue heard his triumphant declaration. "Since we are officially ending this marriage today, Brittany and I will be heading back to the primary estate right after this reception to start moving her belongings into the master bedroom. My children need a proper, spacious home to grow up in. And since we have been legally married for 3 years, my lawyer has already assured me that I am legally entitled to exactly half of all marital assets without question. That includes the luxury mansion, the massive investment portfolios, and of course half of your little healthcare tech company," Jason added with extreme arrogance. He crossed his arms, looking down at me with supreme satisfaction. He genuinely believed he had just successfully conquered my entire life. He thought he was walking away with millions of dollars in effortless wealth and a beautiful new family to match his massive ego. He waited eagerly for me to finally panic, to loudly beg him not to take my hard-earned company, or to angrily scream that the luxury mansion was rightfully mine. I looked at him. I looked at Brittany, who was now beaming brightly, already vividly imagining her brand new luxurious life, sleeping in my custom bed, and spending my corporate money. I took a slow, deep breath, maintaining absolute perfect composure as I stared them down. "Be my guest," I replied calmly, my voice crystal clear and completely devoid of any underlying panic. The guests gasped collectively at my response. Jason frowned, his smug grin faltering for a split second. He had thrown his absolute worst threat at me, and I had practically held the heavy front door wide open for him without fighting back. The financial slaughter was imminent. The immediate aftermath of my casual invitation sent a shockwave through the room. The low murmurs of 200 elite guests rapidly escalated into aggressive whispering. Wealthy investors leaned across their meticulously decorated tables, exchanging deeply confused and highly judgmental glances. My own family members shifted uncomfortably in their velvet chairs, completely unsure of how to react to a bride who was practically handing over her massive fortune without shedding a single tear. But my eyes were momentarily drawn to the front row. Sitting rigidly in her designated seat was Jason's mother, Patricia. Unlike my parents, who were already mentally calculating the incredible financial windfall of this dramatic new arrangement, Patricia looked physically ill. Her face had completely drained of all color, turning an ashen gray under the bright light of the crystal chandeliers. She was staring intensely at the two sleeping infants wrapped securely in Brittany's arms. She did not say a word. She simply pressed her visibly trembling hands against her pale mouth, her eyes wide with a horrified realization that nobody else in the room could possibly understand yet. She knew something deeply catastrophic about her son. I smoothly picked up my crystal flute of champagne from the nearby table. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the expensive vintage wash down my throat while maintaining absolute eye contact with my cheating husband. Jason glared intensely at me, his brief flash of panicked confusion morphing quickly back into deep, bitter irritation. He clearly hated that he was not completely controlling the emotional narrative of the room. He desperately needed me to look broken. He eagerly opened his mouth to speak again, probably to hurl another pathetic rehearsed insult about my demanding career or my perceived lack of maternal instinct. But I did not give him the precious chance to utter another arrogant syllable. I simply raised my free hand in the air and subtly snapped my fingers, gesturing pointedly toward the back of the massive glass venue. I did not need to scream or make a desperate scene to command the attention of the room. 10 grueling years of running hostile boardroom meetings had taught me exactly how to control the pacing of any environment I walked into. The heavy oak doors at the back of the elegant botanical garden swung open for the second time that evening. This time there was no fake victim wearing a stolen wedding dress or crying newborn babies. Walking purposefully through the massive doors was DeAndre. He was Jason's African-American brother-in-law, married to Jason's younger sister, Rachel. But far more importantly, tonight DeAndre was a ruthless, undefeated corporate lawyer who possessed a strategic mind like a steel trap. He stepped confidently into the venue carrying a sleek, custom leather briefcase, dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit that easily outshined Jason's cheap rented tuxedo. DeAndre did not look surprised by the chaotic, humiliating scene unfolding at the beautiful floral altar. Instead, he shook his head slowly side to side, a deeply disappointed and highly amused smirk playing on his face. He walked down the long white aisle with the effortless, intimidating swagger of a legal predator who already knew he had successfully won the court case before the judge even hit the wooden gavel. The wealthy guests parted nervously, deeply intimidated by his overwhelming physical presence and razor-sharp focus. Jason visibly stiffened as DeAndre confidently approached the altar. Their dynamic had always been incredibly strained. Jason constantly felt deeply threatened by DeAndre's massive professional success, high intellect, and unapologetic confidence. DeAndre stopped right next to the small wooden podium, casually set his heavy leather briefcase down on a nearby table, and smoothly clicked the twin golden locks open. The sharp metallic sound echoed clearly, cutting instantly through the nervous whispers of the confused crowd. Jason tried to puff out his chest again, desperately attempting to maintain his false bravado in front of the highly successful corporate lawyer. "What are you doing up here?" Jason demanded loudly, his voice cracking slightly under the intense, heavy pressure of DeAndre's cold, calculating stare. "This is a highly private family matter. Go sit back down with your wife and let me finish dealing with my soon-to-be ex-wife." DeAndre did not immediately answer. He methodically pulled a thick stack of professionally bound legal documents from his dark leather briefcase. He tapped the heavy papers against the wooden podium to align the crisp edges, his movements agonizingly slow and deliberate to build the immense tension. He finally looked up, staring directly into Jason's arrogant eyes, with a look of absolute pity mixed with pure professional disgust. "You really are the dumbest man I have ever had the misfortune of knowing," DeAndre said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the room. Before Jason could open his mouth to fire back an angry response to DeAndre, heavy footsteps echoed loudly against the wooden steps of the altar. My parents. Richard and Diane broke through the front row of shocked guests and aggressively rushed the stage. A normal mother and father would have immediately run to comfort their humiliated daughter, whose husband had just publicly betrayed her on her wedding day. They would have demanded Jason leave the premises or shielded me from the glaring eyes of the audience. But my parents did absolutely none of those things. They did not even look in my direction. Instead, they rushed straight past me, their expensive wedding attire brushing against my custom silk gown, and threw their arms protectively around Brittany. My mother let out a dramatic, emotional sob as she gently stroked the heads of the newborn twins sleeping soundly in her arms. "Oh, my sweet, beautiful girl," my mother, Diane, cried out, pressing a kiss to her cheek. "You have been through so much stress hiding this wonderful blessing from us. We are so incredibly proud of you for finally stepping into the light and claiming your happiness." My father, Richard, stood firmly right beside them, patting Jason forcefully on the shoulder with a proud, congratulatory smile. He looked at Jason as if my cheating husband had just won a prestigious award, completely validating his horrific betrayal in front of my high society peers. I watched my own flesh and blood openly celebrate the total destruction of my marriage without a single ounce of shame. DeAndre simply crossed his arms, stepping back slightly to let my parents fully expose their incredible toxicity to the entire room. After making sure Brittany was perfectly comfortable, Diane finally turned her attention to me. Her warm, maternal smile instantly vanished, replaced by the cold, demanding glare I had known my entire life. "Sienna, we need to handle this unfortunate situation practically and maturely right now," Diane announced, projecting her harsh voice so the front rows of guests could hear every word. "You have always been far too obsessed with your career. You do not have a maternal bone in your body, and Jason clearly recognized that. Brittany is a natural mother. She is delicate, she is sensitive, and she desperately needs a stable environment to raise these precious children." I stared at her, letting her dig her own social grave. "Go on, mother," I said flatly. "Tell me exactly what you think I should do to fix this mess." Diane stepped forward aggressively, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You need to immediately step down as the chief executive officer of your tech company," she demanded with absolute terrifying sincerity. "You have more than enough money to last a lifetime. You will quietly transfer your controlling shares and open a massive family fund to provide for Jason and the twins. Brittany cannot possibly work while raising 2 infants, and Jason needs serious capital to start building a proper legacy for his new family. It is your absolute duty to fund them. You owe this family for taking you in and putting up with your cold, unfeeling personality all these long years." Her twisted logic was genuinely breathtaking. To Diane and Richard, I was never actually a daughter. I was merely a deeply convenient automated teller machine designed specifically to fund their lavish lifestyle and permanently secure the future of their precious golden child. Growing up, whenever Brittany failed a class, I was forced to pay for her expensive tutors. When Brittany totaled her luxury car in college, My parents forcefully demanded I empty my personal savings account to quickly buy her a brand new one so she would not be inconvenienced. I had spent my entire adult life building an $8 million empire while constantly fending off their relentless financial demands. They had always treated me like a soulless bank vault, expecting me to mindlessly produce endless cash while showering Brittany with all the warmth, love, and protection I was actively denied. So let me get this perfectly straight, I replied, my voice echoing coldly across the silent venue. My husband publicly cheats on me with my adopted stepsister, humiliates me in front of my investors, and demands a divorce, and your immediate solution is to demand I surrender my entire company to permanently finance their romantic betrayal. You have always been so utterly selfish and incredibly greedy. Sienna. Richard spat back angrily, stepping defensively in front of Brittany to physically shield her from my view. Your sister is extremely vulnerable right now. You only care about your money and absolute power. Just do the right thing for once in your miserable life and generously give them the financial security they both absolutely deserve today. I did not raise my voice or physically react to my father throwing his venomous insults directly in my face. I looked at the two of them standing there on the altar, fiercely guarding a manipulative woman who had never worked a single day in her life, and a man who had just proudly humiliated their actual biological daughter. Are you both absolutely certain about this decision? I asked quietly, ensuring my cold tone carried perfectly across the hushed and intensely observant venue. Are you both fully prepared to bet your entire retirement fund, your heavily mortgaged home, and your complete financial future on Brittany and Jason? I want you to verbally answer me right now in front of all these elite witnesses. My mother rolled her eyes dramatically, scoffing loudly at what she clearly perceived as a weak and deeply desperate threat from a losing woman. Of course, we are completely certain about this, she snapped back quickly with absolute pure disdain. Brittany is our real family now. Jason is the wonderful father of our beautiful new grandchildren. We will fiercely support them with absolutely everything we have, because that is exactly what real and unconditionally loving families always do. My father nodded his head firmly in absolute agreement with her, puffing his broad chest out as he glared at me. We are backing them 100% without any hesitation, he stated proudly for the entire crowd to hear. You can keep your cold, lonely corporate life and your meaningless money, but do not ever expect us to abandon them when they desperately need our help the most. I simply nodded my head once, permanently locking away their deeply arrogant public declaration in my mind. I specifically wanted them to clearly state their unwavering allegiance aloud before I completely pulled the massive financial rug right out from under them. Excellent, I replied smoothly. Remember that you actively made this terrible choice today. Before my parents could even question my unusually calm response, Jason forcefully pushed his way back to the absolute center of the beautiful floral altar. He was no longer standing alone up there. Trailing closely behind his shoulder was a remarkably nervous-looking man, dressed in an ill-fitting brown suit, tightly clutching an incredibly cheap plastic briefcase. This was his personal attorney, a discount lawyer he most likely found on a desperate late-night television commercial. Jason pointed a highly demanding finger right at my face. "Enough of this completely pointless family drama right now," Jason declared loudly to the silent room. "We are settling the absolute financial division right here and right now. My lawyer has thoroughly reviewed the state marital laws, and you are absolutely not walking away with my incredibly fair share of this massive fortune." The discount lawyer nervously cleared his throat, anxiously adjusting his thick glasses under the incredibly intense glare of 200 highly influential corporate guests. He awkwardly opened his cheap briefcase and quickly pulled out a thin stack of freshly printed legal papers. According to the strict state laws governing the mandatory division of marital property, the lawyer began reading incredibly stiffly from his prepared script. My client Jason is legally entitled to exactly 50% of all valuable assets acquired during the duration of your 3-year marriage. This firmly includes the primary luxury mansion located in Silicon Valley and exactly half of the highly estimated $8 million valuation of the healthcare tech company currently managed exclusively by your client today. The lawyer paused briefly, looking around, expecting applause for his basic recitation. Met with absolute cold silence from my investors, he puffed out his narrow chest and boldly continued speaking. Furthermore, my client expects immediate unrestricted access to the joint bank accounts to perfectly facilitate transitioning his new family into the primary estate tonight. If these demands are not fully met immediately, we will actively file an emergency injunction tomorrow morning that will freeze all assets and aggressively drag your company through a highly publicized litigation process. Jason crossed his arms, incredibly proudly grinning broadly, like he had brilliantly checkmated a grandmaster. He genuinely thought the terrifying threat of bad press would instantly bring me sobbing to my knees. He vividly knew I was currently negotiating a massive funding round with several powerful venture capitalists sitting quietly in the audience right now. He greedily calculated that I would gladly surrender $4 million and a luxury mansion just to keep my lucrative business deals entirely safe. Brittany smiled brightly. I let the heavy silence hang over the botanical garden for a few agonizing seconds, allowing their arrogant demands to completely saturate the stunned room. Then I slowly turned my head and gave a slight acknowledging nod to DeAndre, who was standing perfectly calmly there. DeAndre calmly picked up the microphone Jason had foolishly left resting on the wooden podium. He tapped it twice, ensuring the sound system was perfectly calibrated before turning to face the completely silent crowd of 200 elite guests. He did not look angry. He looked supremely confident, radiating the absolute authority of a man who commanded high-stakes corporate boardrooms every single day of the week. "Good evening, everyone." DeAndre began, his smooth voice echoing powerfully across the tense botanical garden venue. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is DeAndre. I am married to Jason's younger sister, Rachel. But I am absolutely not standing up here tonight in the capacity of a supportive brother-in-law. I am standing here as the senior managing partner of Sterling and Vance Corporate Law. And more importantly, I am standing here as the primary legal counsel specifically retained by Sienna over 8 months ago." A collective gasp swept through the wealthy crowd. My parents completely froze, their proud smiles instantly vanishing from their faces. Jason took a sudden step backward, his previous arrogance immediately replaced by genuine panic. His incredibly cheap discount lawyer visibly shrank under DeAndre's intense gaze, desperately trying to hide behind his flimsy plastic briefcase. DeAndre slowly turned his attention directly to the nervous man in the poorly fitted brown suit. He looked him up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated professional disgust. He did not even bother asking for the man's name. "Are you seriously the legal representation Jason brought to a high-stakes asset division negotiation?" DeAndre asked, his tone dripping with absolute mockery. "I have seen better legal strategy from first-year law students arguing over parking tickets. You stood up here and confidently quoted standard marital property division laws to a crowd full of seasoned venture capitalists and corporate executives. Did you actually bother to conduct even a basic preliminary asset search before aggressively threatening an emergency injunction against an $8 million healthcare tech company? Did you even bother to properly verify if those assets were legally eligible for marital division in this specific state?" The discount lawyer swallowed hard, thick beads of nervous sweat forming quickly on his forehead. He opened his mouth to weakly defend himself, but DeAndre completely cut him off before he could utter a single pathetic syllable. "Do not answer that," DeAndre commanded sharply. "Because if you actually did your basic due diligence, you would immediately know that you are currently standing on a public stage, committing professional malpractice by confidently advising your deeply misguided client to actively demand assets he has absolutely zero legal claim to. You are completely out of your depth here. I strongly suggest you pack up your little plastic briefcase and quickly walk out those back doors before I personally decide to report your incredibly embarrassing performance to the State Bar Association tomorrow morning." The discount lawyer did exactly what DeAndre suggested. Without saying another word, he frantically snapped his cheap briefcase shut, practically sprinted down the altar steps, and hurried out of the beautiful glass venue, leaving Jason completely abandoned and legally defenseless in front of his elite peers. Jason looked frantically around the room, desperately searching for anyone willing to support his rapidly collapsing plan. But the wealthy guest simply stared back at him with pure disdain. Even his own mother, Patricia, remained completely silent in her front row seat, her face still pale with absolute horror. DeAndre casually tossed the legal documents the discount lawyer had brought straight into a nearby trash can. He then turned his full, terrifying attention back to Jason. "You honestly thought you were the smartest person in this entire room tonight," DeAndre stated coldly, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "You genuinely thought you could brilliantly manipulate a highly successful chief executive officer, boldly cheat on her with her adopted stepsister, and simply walk away with millions of dollars in effortless wealth. You thought Sienna was just too busy completely ignoring you to ever notice your pathetic little secret romance." Jason clenched his fists tightly, his face turning a deep, angry red. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about," Jason yelled defensively, completely dropping his fake sympathetic act. "Sienna never knew anything. She was always entirely obsessed with her stupid company. She completely neglected me for years." DeAndre laughed out loud, a harsh, unforgiving sound that echoed through the tense botanical garden. "Neglected you?" DeAndre repeated mockingly. "Jason, she practically funded your entire miserable existence. And she definitely knew about your pathetic affair. She did not just find out today when you dramatically paraded your mistress and those poor children through those doors. Sienna has known exactly what you and Brittany were secretly doing for the last 8 straight months. She has known every single disgusting detail, every secret hotel meeting, and every desperate financial transaction you foolishly made. And unlike you, she did not dramatically throw a pathetic public tantrum. She immediately called her corporate lawyer, and we quietly started building an absolutely inescapable legal trap while you were busy playing house." DeAndre did not wait for Jason to formulate another pathetic excuse. He turned his back on my trembling husband and smoothly walked over to the massive audio-visual control panel, discreetly positioned near the floral archway. This was the exact system my expensive wedding planners had specifically set up to display our romantic photo montage during the reception dinner. DeAndre reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a sleek silver tablet, and plugged a cable directly into the main projector feed. With a single confident swipe of his finger across the glass screen, the elegant ambient lighting in the botanical garden dimmed perfectly. The enormous high-definition screen suspended right above the beautiful altar instantly flickered to life. The 200 wealthy guests leaned forward in their velvet chairs, completely captivated by the unfolding corporate execution. They were fully expecting to see a humiliating video of Jason and Brittany caught in the act. Instead, the massive screen illuminated the dark room with brightly colored rows and columns of detailed financial spreadsheets. Jason whipped his head around to look at the giant screen. His face drained of all its remaining color, turning a sickly pale shade of white. Brittany gasped loudly, instinctively, taking a step back and clutching the newborn twins closer to her chest. "What you are all currently looking at," DeAndre announced loudly, picking the microphone back up and pacing slowly across the stage, "are the highly detailed billing statements for the corporate credit card officially issued to Jason during his brief and entirely useless tenure as a consultant for Sienna's healthcare tech company. As many of the brilliant venture capitalists sitting in this audience already know, utilizing corporate company funds for unauthorized personal expenses is not just a simple mistake. It is absolute textbook financial fraud and direct corporate embezzlement." DeAndre tapped his tablet screen again, a specific section of the massive spreadsheet magnified greatly, filling the entire display so even the guests sitting in the very back row could clearly read the damning numbers. "Let us take a closer look at these fascinating business expenses," DeAndre narrated, acting like a seasoned professor delivering a lecture to a deeply engaged class. On April 12th, Jason charged $14,000 at a Cartier boutique downtown. "Did you receive a new diamond necklace recently, Sienna?" I shook my head slowly, taking another calm sip of my champagne. "No, I did not," I replied clearly. DeAndre nodded in mock sympathy. "How incredibly strange," DeAndre said loudly. Because according to the security footage we legally subpoenaed from that exact luxury boutique, Jason purchased a stunning diamond tennis bracelet and secured it directly around Brittany's wrist. The wealthy crowd loudly gasped again. My mother Diane opened her mouth in shock, staring at the sparkling jewelry currently wrapped around Brittany's arm. But DeAndre was not even close to being finished with them. He swiped his screen again, highlighting a series of massive recurring charges spanning several months. Here we have multiple charges totaling over $30,000 at an exclusive high-end maternity boutique in Beverly Hills. DeAndre continued relentlessly. And another $25,000 spent on luxury weekend getaways at five-star coastal resorts. Jason used stolen company funds to fully finance his secret romantic vacations, while his wife was working 80-hour weeks securing Series B funding for her startup. Jason lunged forward desperately, trying to grab the microphone out of DeAndre's hand. "Turn it off right now!" Jason screamed frantically, his voice cracking with absolute raw panic. "You are completely ruining my life." DeAndre easily sidestepped the pathetic physical attack, holding the microphone firmly out of Jason's reach. "You ruined your own life the exact second you decided to steal from a woman who is 10 times smarter than you will ever be." DeAndre shot back coldly. "You deliberately committed grand larceny. Every single luxury item Brittany is currently wearing, including the very clothes on her back, was illegally purchased with stolen corporate funds." Brittany looked down at the expensive white lace gown she was proudly wearing, her face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. She quickly tried to cover her diamond Cartier bracelet with her hand, but the severe damage was already permanently done. The high society guests were no longer looking at her with any sympathy or pity. They were glaring at her with absolute sheer disgust. She was completely exposed as nothing more than a greedy thief wearing stolen goods. My father Richard nervously stepped away from her, suddenly eager to entirely distance himself from a highly publicized federal crime. Jason stood perfectly frozen on the altar, breathing heavily as the undeniable financial evidence brightly illuminated his terrified face. I took another slow sip of my vintage champagne, quietly watching my perfectly executed trap clamp down tightly. Beautiful. Jason stared at the massive high-definition screen illuminating his catastrophic financial crimes, but the arrogant smirk slowly crept back onto his face. He aggressively adjusted the lapels of his cheap rented tuxedo, completely ignoring the disgusted murmurs echoing throughout the botanical garden. He genuinely thought he still held the absolute winning hand. "It really does not matter how I spent that corporate money," Jason declared loudly into the microphone, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated entitlement. "Those expenses are completely irrelevant now. We have been legally married for 3 straight years in this specific state. Therefore, I am automatically entitled to exactly 50% of all the marital assets we currently share. That includes half of the luxury mansion and exactly $4 million from her little healthcare tech company. You can try to embarrass me with credit card statements all you want, DeAndre, but the rigid state law is entirely on my side. I am taking my hard-earned half, and there is absolutely nothing you or Sienna can legally do to stop me." DeAndre did not look angry at Jason's bold and incredibly ignorant declaration. He looked profoundly amused. He slowly tapped his silver tablet one more time, completely turning off the blinding projector screen. The elegant ambient lighting of the botanical garden returned, casting long shadows across Jason's smug face. "You really should have hired a competent lawyer instead of that discount clown who just sprinted out the back door," DeAndre said smoothly, his deep voice carrying a lethal edge of absolute authority. "Because if you had actually hired real legal counsel, they would have immediately pulled the property deeds and corporate ownership filings before you proudly embarrassed yourself in front of 200 elite corporate guests." Jason frowned deeply, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as genuine confusion washed over his face. "What are you talking about?" Jason demanded sharply, taking an aggressive step forward. "The mansion was purchased 2 years ago while we were legally married. Sienna officially founded the tech company after we signed the marriage certificate. Those are textbook marital assets. I am legally taking half of everything she owns." DeAndre slowly shook his head side to side in mock pity. You are taking absolutely nothing, Jason DeAndre announced, clearly ensuring his booming voice reached the very back row of the venue. The $8 million healthcare tech company does not actually belong to Sienna, and the luxury mansion you were so eagerly planning to move your mistress into tonight does not belong to Sienna either. Because legally, Sienna does not actually own a single valuable asset in her own name. The entire venue fell dead silent. Even the evening breeze outside seemed to completely stop blowing. My parents, Richard and Diane, stared blankly at DeAndre, their greedy minds completely failing to process this massive financial bombshell. Brittany, visibly panicked, aggressively clutching the newborn twins closer to her chest, as the terrifying reality of the situation slowly dawned on her. Jason let out a harsh, incredibly nervous laugh, aggressively pointing a trembling finger at DeAndre. "You are completely lying," Jason shouted, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "You are just trying to aggressively stall the divorce proceedings. I literally live in that massive house. I legally watched her sign the property deed 2 years ago. I know exactly how much that company is worth. She owns it all." DeAndre calmly unlatched his heavy leather briefcase again. He pulled out a single heavily notarized legal document, enclosed in a thick blue folder, and aggressively slapped it down onto the wooden podium. "She signed the property deed on behalf of an entity," DeAndre corrected sharply, his voice slicing through Jason's frantic denial like a razor blade. "Exactly 3 years ago, approximately 2 weeks before she legally married you for health insurance purposes, Sienna came directly to my corporate law firm. She explicitly instructed me to heavily restructure her entire growing financial portfolio. We officially established an irrevocable trust, and she aggressively transferred absolute ownership of her startup company, all her future real estate acquisitions, and every single one of her massive investment accounts directly into that incredibly secure trust." Jason stared blankly at the thick blue folder resting on the podium, his breathing becoming highly erratic as his pathetic financial scheme completely disintegrated in front of him. "But I am her legal husband," Jason stammered desperately, his arrogant facade totally shattered into a million tiny pieces. "I am legally entitled to half of whatever she controls." DeAndre leaned aggressively over the wooden podium, staring directly down at Jason with absolute terrifying dominance. "You clearly do not understand what an irrevocable trust actually means," DeAndre explained, coldly enunciating every single word for maximum psychological damage. "Once an asset is legally transferred into an irrevocable trust, the original owner permanently surrenders all direct legal ownership. The trust completely owns the assets now, not Sienna. And because she strategically established and fully funded this trust before the marriage officially began, those massive assets are permanently shielded from any marital division laws. They are utterly untouchable. The $8 million tech company is completely out of your greedy reach. The luxury mansion you desperately wanted is completely off limits. You are legally entitled to absolutely nothing. You are walking away from this marriage with empty pockets and a heavily ruined professional reputation." Jason stood completely frozen on the altar as the crushing weight of DeAndre's words finally settled over him. His chest heaved violently, his eyes darting frantically between my calm expression and the thick blue folder resting on the wooden podium. He violently shook his head, refusing to accept the catastrophic reality of his situation. He reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket with trembling hands and aggressively pulled out the folded divorce papers I had just signed moments ago. He held them high in the air like a desperate shield, waving the flimsy pages frantically at DeAndre. "You are completely forgetting about this legally binding document," Jason shouted, his voice cracking with a pathetic mixture of intense fear and blind arrogance. "She just signed this exact agreement willingly in front of 200 elite witnesses. These papers explicitly state the immediate dissolution of our marriage and the fair distribution of assets. I am still walking away with massive alimony payments and spousal support for the rest of my life." DeAndre let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed sharply against the glass walls of the botanical garden. He slowly walked down the altar steps, closing the distance between himself and my terrified husband. He gently reached out and plucked the heavily crumpled divorce papers directly out of Jason's trembling grip. Jason was entirely too stunned to even try to fight back. DeAndre casually flipped through the cheap pages, his eyes scanning the poorly formatted legal jargon with absolute professional amusement. I was honestly wondering when you were finally going to bring up this magnificent piece of absolute garbage, DeAndre said smoothly, holding the document up to the bright chandelier light. As I previously mentioned, your discount lawyer was a complete amateur. He clearly went online last night, found a highly generic boilerplate divorce template, and hastily printed it out without bothering to actually read the specific clauses buried deep in the fine print. You were so incredibly desperate to publicly humiliate Sienna and aggressively force a quick signature that you completely failed to review your own legal demands. DeAndre tapped a specific paragraph near the bottom of the second page with his index finger. Allow me to educate you on a beautiful little legal concept known as an at-fault infidelity penalty clause, DeAndre announced loudly, ensuring the wealthy audience heard every single word. This standard boilerplate template you proudly brought tonight includes a very strict, legally binding stipulation. It explicitly states that if the marriage is forcefully dissolved due to the proven undeniable infidelity of one specific party, the cheating spouse automatically forfeits all legal rights to any form of alimony, spousal support, or asset division. Jason stared at the paper, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. DeAndre smiled coldly. In a normal court proceeding, proving undeniable infidelity can sometimes take months of expensive litigation, DeAndre continued relentlessly. But you are a remarkably special kind of stupid, Jason. You literally just stood on a public stage in front of 200 highly influential witnesses, proudly paraded your pregnant mistress around the room, and loudly confessed your long-term adultery into a live microphone. You intentionally provided us with a perfectly recorded, undeniable confession of absolute fault. By forcing Sienna to aggressively sign this specific document today, under these exact circumstances, you unknowingly activated the absolute harshest penalty clause available in state family law. You legally screwed your entire life. You just officially signed away every single penny of potential spousal support you ever hoped to aggressively extract from my wealthy client. Jason staggered backward, completely losing his balance and heavily crashing into the wooden podium. His arrogant facade was finally entirely destroyed, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked desperately toward Brittany, who was currently weeping loudly, holding the twins tightly, while realizing her massive payday had completely vanished into thin air. But DeAndre was not quite finished delivering his devastating legal blows. Oh, and it gets significantly worse for you, DeAndre added cheerfully, stepping right into Jason's personal space. Because you are legally receiving zero alimony and walking away entirely empty-handed, you are now completely unprotected from civil liability. Those corporate credit card statements I just prominently displayed on the massive projector screen are not going away quietly. You committed aggressive financial fraud and direct corporate embezzlement to the exact tune of $55,000. Since you have absolutely zero claim to Sienna's vast financial resources, you personally owe her company that exact amount in full. If you do not immediately repay every single stolen dollar by the end of this month, my law firm will aggressively file federal criminal charges against you. You will not just be entirely broke and humiliated today. You will be going straight to federal prison very soon indeed. The heavy silence following DeAndre's brutal legal execution was shattered by a sharp, panicked gasp from Brittany. She stood near the floral archway, her knuckles turning completely white as she gripped the newborn twins. The sweet, innocent mother act she had so perfectly maintained for the last hour instantly evaporated into thin air. Her wide, tearful eyes hardened into a furious, calculating glare. She stared at Jason, who was still leaning heavily against the wooden podium, looking like a man who had just been forcefully hit by a speeding freight train. Brittany aggressively marched toward him, completely ignoring the shocked whispers of the wealthy guests. "What on earth is he talking about, Jason?" Brittany demanded, her voice shrill and echoing loudly across the botanical garden. Her tone was no longer soft and vulnerable. It was harsh, grating, and incredibly demanding. Tell me he is lying right now. Tell me you actually get half of the money and the luxury mansion like you promised me. You explicitly swore to me that we were moving into the primary estate tonight. You promised me a massive trust fund for the babies and a permanent life of luxury. Jason frantically held up his hands, desperately trying to calm her down in front of my elite investors. Brittany, please just lower your voice, Jason pleaded weakly, his face flushed with extreme embarrassment. We can figure this out later. My lawyer just made a tiny mistake. We will simply take her to court and fight the trust fund. I am still her legal husband. We will definitely get our fair share. Do not tell me to lower my voice, you absolute idiot, Brittany screamed completely, losing whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left. I did not spend the last 8 months hiding in cheap hotel rooms and ruining my relationship with my wealthy family just to end up with a broke, unemployed loser facing federal prison time. You told me Sienna was entirely clueless. You specifically told me she would just roll over and hand you millions of dollars to quickly avoid a public scandal. You said you had a flawless legal plan to secure the mansion. Where is the mansion, Jason? Where are my millions? I slowly leaned back against the edge of the altar, thoroughly enjoying the spectacular collapse of their pathetic romance. I raised my crystal flute and took another slow sip of my vintage champagne. My parents, Richard and Diane, watched in absolute horror as their precious golden child revealed her true, incredibly greedy nature to the entire high society crowd. They had aggressively defended her just moments ago, proudly claiming she was driven by pure love and maternal instinct. Now they were forcefully confronted with the undeniable reality that Brittany only ever wanted my massive wealth, and she was perfectly willing to destroy my marriage to steal it. Jason stared at Brittany, his desperate eyes searching her furious face for any sign of the deep soulmate connection he had so proudly bragged about earlier. But there was absolutely no love there. There was only raw, unadulterated financial panic. You only wanted the money, Jason whispered, his voice cracking with a pathetic mixture of profound betrayal and ultimate realization. You told me you loved me for who I was. You said I was a strong, capable man who deserved to be treated like a king. Are you genuinely that stupid? Brittany laughed harshly, a cruel and ugly sound that made several guests physically cringe. Why would I ever want to build a life with a middle management failure who cannot even afford his own health insurance? I wanted the $8 million tech company. I wanted the Silicon Valley estate. I only wanted you because you were my direct golden ticket to Sienna's bank accounts, and you completely ruined it. You signed the stupid penalty clause and gave away everything. The sheer irony of the situation was absolutely delicious. Jason had completely convinced himself that he was a brilliant mastermind, effortlessly manipulating 2 different women to secure a life of endless luxury. In reality, he was nothing more than a highly gullible pawn in Brittany's greedy financial scheme. And Brittany had foolishly hitched her entire future to a man who was utterly incapable of actually outsmarting me. They had both aggressively plotted to destroy my life, and instead, they had perfectly engineered their own mutual destruction. I did not need to scream, cry, or hurl insults. I just had to sit back, remain perfectly calm, and let their own toxic greed completely devour them from the inside out. The 2 villains were aggressively tearing each other apart on my beautifully decorated altar, and I had the best seat in the entire house. I simply watched my enemies completely destroy themselves today. But Brittany was not quite ready to surrender her carefully crafted, innocent persona. As the harsh reality of her massive financial miscalculations settled in, she quickly realized that turning into an aggressive, greedy monster in front of 200 elite guests was destroying her pristine social standing. She desperately needed to pivot back to playing the helpless victim to salvage whatever tiny shred of sympathy she could extract from my incredibly gullible parents. She forced fresh tears to well up in her wide eyes, intentionally letting her voice tremble as she pointed a manicured finger directly at Jason. "You lied to me!" Brittany cried out, her voice echoing with manufactured heartbreak. "You manipulated me from the very beginning. You told me Sienna was abusive and that you desperately needed someone to simply love you. I was in a deeply vulnerable place, and you heavily preyed on my trusting nature. You forcefully pushed me into this terrible situation and convinced me that we were meant to be together forever. I never wanted to hurt my sister. My parents, Richard and Diane, immediately rushed right back to her side, swallowing her pathetic performance without a single ounce of hesitation. Diane wrapped her arms tightly around Brittany, glaring at Jason with absolute pure hatred. "You disgusting monster," Diane spat violently at my terrified husband. "You deliberately took absolute advantage of our sweet, innocent daughter. You completely brainwashed her into participating in this horrific public spectacle. We are going to aggressively sue you for severe emotional distress." Jason stood there completely dumbfounded, utterly incapable of effectively defending himself against their sudden aggressive verbal assault. I let out a soft, amused sigh. It was finally time to permanently shatter her fake innocent victim narrative once and for all. I calmly reached into the hidden pocket of my custom silk wedding gown and pulled out my sleek smartphone. I unlocked the screen and pulled up a highly specific audio file I had been saving for this exact perfect moment. I casually handed the phone directly over to DeAndre, who immediately understood my silent instruction. He smoothly plugged the phone into the massive audiovisual control panel. "Brittany, you really should be significantly more careful about exactly who you choose to trust with your deepest secrets," I announced clearly over the microphone. "Especially when your best friends are incredibly eager to completely sell you out for a very small fraction of the money you currently owe them." DeAndre confidently pressed play. The massive speakers surrounding the beautiful botanical garden crackled to life. Instead of romantic wedding music, a crystal-clear audio recording began playing at maximum volume for the entire high society crowd to hear. It was Brittany's unmistakable voice, completely devoid of any sweet innocence or manufactured tears. She sounded arrogant, highly calculating, and deeply cynical. "I cannot believe how incredibly easy this actually is." Brittany's recorded voice laughed harshly through the massive speakers. "Jason is genuinely the dumbest man I have ever met in my life. All I literally have to do is cry a little bit and tell him he is incredibly handsome and he aggressively buys me whatever I want." Another female voice giggled on the recording. "But are you actually going to marry him?" the friend asked curiously. "He is completely obsessed with you." "Marry him?" Brittany scoffed loudly on the clear recording. "Absolutely not. I am just securely riding this incredibly lucrative gravy train until my massive debts are completely paid off. Sienna has an $8 million company, and Jason is legally entitled to exactly half of it. I am currently hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt from those botched cosmetic surgeries and maxed out credit cards. As soon as Jason forcefully divorces that cold corporate robot and easily secures his massive payout, I am taking my generous cut and leaving him entirely in the dust. He actually thinks these babies are the key to securing his financial future. He is completely clueless." DeAndre calmly reached over and pressed pause, letting the brutal, undeniable truth aggressively hang in the dead, silent air of the elegant venue. The entire room stared at Brittany in absolute sheer disgust. Even my heavily biased parents slowly backed away from her, completely dropping their protective embrace. They had just heard their precious, highly innocent golden child explicitly confess to intentionally seducing a married man solely to aggressively steal millions of dollars to selfishly pay off her massive secret debts. Brittany stood completely frozen on the stage, her face turning a sickly shade of chalk white. She looked desperately around the massive room, frantically searching for a single friendly face, but she found absolutely nothing but pure, cold, unadulterated contempt from every single elite guest in attendance tonight. DeAndre smoothly unplugged my phone from the massive audiovisual control panel and handed it back to me. He did not give Brittany a single second to attempt another pathetic, tearful defense. He immediately turned his full attention back to Jason, who was currently staring at his supposed soulmate with absolute, unadulterated horror. Jason's entire world was violently crumbling right before his eyes, and DeAndre was more than happy to aggressively deliver the final crushing blows. DeAndre walked back to the wooden podium and calmly opened his heavy leather briefcase one more time. He pulled out a remarkably thick red folder, completely stuffed with densely printed financial documents. He tapped the thick red folder firmly against the podium, the sharp sound cutting right through the tense murmuring of the elite crowd. You honestly thought you were aggressively securing a beautiful, innocent woman who was going to build a perfect luxury life with you, DeAndre said, his deep voice carrying a lethal, mocking edge. But since your discount lawyer completely failed to conduct even a basic preliminary background check on the woman you just proudly paraded in front of 200 wealthy guests, my firm decided to do the heavy lifting for you. We conducted a comprehensive financial audit on Brittany last week. Jason swallowed hard, his face pale and glistening with cold sweat. He took a hesitant step backward, clearly terrified of whatever new nightmare was hidden inside that thick red folder. Brittany let out a sharp, panicked gasp. She lunged forward desperately, trying to snatch the red folder right out of DeAndre's hands. "Give that to me right now," Brittany shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered desperation. "You have absolutely no legal right to access my private financial records. That is completely illegal." DeAndre easily held the thick folder high above her desperate reach, looking down at her with absolute professional disdain. "When you actively plot to aggressively defraud my wealthy client out of exactly $4 million, your entire life becomes my legal business," DeAndre replied coldly, completely shutting down her pathetic protest. He opened the red folder and smoothly extracted a neatly stapled stack of highly official bank statements and aggressive collection agency notices. "Let us briefly discuss Brittany's current financial portfolio," DeAndre announced loudly, projecting his voice so every single elite investor and high society family member could clearly hear the devastating truth. It appears that aggressively maintaining the illusion of a wealthy, perfectly polished golden child is an incredibly expensive endeavor. According to these legally verified documents, Brittany currently holds exactly $400,000 in highly delinquent personal debt. The wealthy crowd let out a massive collective gasp. My parents, Richard and Diane, stared at Brittany in absolute utter shock, their jaws literally dropping open. They had proudly funded her lavish lifestyle for years, but they clearly had absolutely no idea she was secretly drowning in a massive ocean of catastrophic debt. $400,000, Jason repeated weakly, his voice barely a terrified whisper. "How is that even physically possible? She does not even own a house or a car." DeAndre smiled ruthlessly, thoroughly enjoying Jason's complete psychological destruction. "Oh, the breakdown is absolutely fascinating," DeAndre continued, flipping casually through the dense financial papers. "Approximately $150,000 of that massive debt is from entirely maxed out high-interest credit cards used primarily for luxury designer clothing, expensive international vacations, and exclusive fine dining. Another $50,000 is from highly delinquent personal loans she aggressively defaulted on over 2 years ago. But the absolute best part, the crown jewel of her massive financial ruin, is the remaining $200,000. DeAndre paused for dramatic effect, letting the intense silence aggressively build in the beautiful botanical garden venue. That massive sum is entirely comprised of heavily defaulted medical debt from a series of highly elective, largely botched cosmetic surgeries she secretly underwent in South America because she could not afford reputable local surgeons," DeAndre revealed loudly. "She has been aggressively dodging aggressive collection agencies and threatening legal summons for the last 3 straight years. She is completely, utterly bankrupt in every conceivable way. She currently has absolutely zero assets, zero income, and a thoroughly destroyed credit score that will easily prevent her from even renting a cheap studio apartment." Jason stared at Brittany, his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. The beautiful, innocent soulmate he had proudly abandoned his entire marriage for was actually a highly manipulative, deeply desperate financial black hole. She did not fiercely love him. She had aggressively targeted him because he was her only viable escape route from total financial annihilation. She desperately needed his legally mandated half of my massive fortune to quickly pay off her catastrophic debts and permanently save herself from impending legal ruin. And Jason, blinded entirely by his massive ego and pathetic greed, had eagerly walked right into her desperate, highly calculated trap. He had aggressively thrown away an $8 million CEO wife for a woman who was secretly drowning in $400,000 of catastrophic, inescapable debt. Jason violently shook his head physically, backing away from Brittany as if she were suddenly infected with a highly contagious disease. He held his hands up defensively, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "That has absolutely nothing to do with me," Jason stammered loudly, desperately trying to project a false sense of security to the wealthy crowd. "That is entirely her own financial problem. I never co-signed any of those massive loans. I never authorized those ridiculous cosmetic surgeries. We are not even legally married yet. I am just leaving Sienna to be with my kids. Brittany's catastrophic debt is completely her own burden to carry. I am not legally responsible for a single penny of that $400,000. DeAndre let out a slow, dark chuckle that completely silenced Jason's frantic rambling. He closed the thick red folder and leaned casually against the wooden podium. "You really have an incredible talent for being entirely wrong about absolutely everything," DeAndre mocked smoothly. "You see, Jason, family law in this particular state has evolved significantly over the last few years to aggressively protect children and heavily penalize deadbeat parents. The state legislature recently passed a highly specific set of legal statutes regarding the aggressive assumption of financial liability when establishing a brand new family unit." Jason blinked, his false confidence instantly evaporating. "What are you talking about?" he demanded weakly. DeAndre reached into his suit jacket and pulled out one final piece of paper. It was not a thick legal folder or a massive corporate spreadsheet. It was a single standard hospital form printed on pale pink paper. "Do you recognize this specific document?" Jason, DeAndre asked, holding it up so the bright chandelier light caught the official state seal stamped at the very top. "I legally obtained a certified copy of this form directly from the hospital records department just yesterday afternoon. This is the voluntary paternity acknowledgement form you so eagerly rushed to sign the exact moment those twins were officially born." Brittany let out a sharp, terrified whimper, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. Jason stared at the pink paper, swallowing hard. "So what?" Jason argued defensively, his voice cracking violently. "They are my biological children. I proudly wanted my name on their official birth certificates. Signing that standard hospital form just proves that I am a dedicated father, stepping up to take full responsibility for my own flesh and blood. It has absolutely nothing to do with her massive credit card debt." DeAndre smiled, a ruthless, terrifying smile that sent a visible shiver down Jason's spine. "That is exactly where your profound legal ignorance has completely destroyed you," DeAndre explained with surgical precision. "By eagerly signing this voluntary paternity acknowledgement form, you did not just claim basic parental rights. You legally established an official binding domestic partnership with a severely indebted individual under the brand new Family Financial Integration Act. You aggressively pushed to legitimize this new family unit while still legally married to Sienna. Because you formally claimed these children and publicly declared your absolute intention to fully support this woman as your primary partner today, the state automatically merges your financial liabilities to completely prevent welfare exploitation." The entire botanical garden venue was dead silent, hanging on to every single devastating word. DeAndre stepped right up to Jason, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "You forcefully demanded a divorce today to officially legitimize your new family," DeAndre whispered loudly. "Congratulations, Jason. You are officially legitimate. You formally adopted her catastrophic financial ruin. The state law now views you as a fully integrated domestic unit. You are now entirely legally responsible for her $400,000 of severely defaulted debt." When the aggressive collection agencies come knocking tomorrow morning, and they absolutely will, they will be garnishing your pathetic middle management wages for the rest of your miserable life. Jason collapsed to his knees right there on the beautiful floral altar. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He stared blankly at the expensive white marble floor, completely unable to process the absolute magnitude of his utter destruction. He had aggressively walked into this venue, expecting to effortlessly steal exactly $4 million and a luxury Silicon Valley mansion. Instead, he was walking out entirely penniless, owing Sienna $55,000 for corporate embezzlement and permanently shackled to $400,000 of inescapable medical and credit card debt. The inescapable financial trap had violently snapped shut around his neck, and he had eagerly tightened the heavy noose with his own arrogant hands. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but pure, icy satisfaction as his entire pathetic life crumbled. He was completely broken. There was no possible escape left for him anymore. My brilliant legal trap had finally closed flawlessly. Jason remained on his knees for a long, agonizing minute. The harsh reality of his absolute financial destruction pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. He had strutted into this botanical garden venue expecting to walk away a multimillionaire. Now he was staring down the barrel of $500,000 in sudden, inescapable debt and a highly probable federal prison sentence. Slowly he pushed himself up from the cold marble floor. His perfectly styled hair was a mess. His cheap, rented tuxedo looked ridiculous on his trembling frame. When he finally looked up, his eyes did not find me. His eyes found Brittany. The woman he had proudly called his absolute soulmate just 30 minutes ago was now the singular source of his complete and total ruin. Jason snapped. He let out a primal guttural scream that echoed violently across the glass walls of the venue, completely shattering whatever tiny amount of composure he had left. He lunged forward, closing the distance between himself and Brittany so fast that my father Richard actively stumbled backward to get out of his way. "You ruined my entire life!" Jason roared, pointing a trembling finger directly in her face. "You absolutely greedy lying parasite. You set me up. You intentionally let me throw away a massive fortune just so you could securely trap me into paying off your pathetic cosmetic surgeries. I threw away an $8 million CEO for you. I embezzled corporate funds to buy you diamonds, and you are secretly drowning in $400,000 of debt. You are absolutely nothing but a completely desperate fraud." Brittany physically flinched, clutching the babies tightly against her chest as Jason towered over her. But her fear quickly morphed back into vicious defensive anger. She was completely cornered, and she knew her pristine innocent act was entirely dead. She bared her teeth, glaring right back at the man she had manipulated so easily. "Do not you dare stand there and act like a completely innocent victim!" Brittany screamed right back, her voice echoing shrilly over the microphone that was still resting on the podium. "You were the one who aggressively pursued me. You were the one who constantly bragged about how incredibly easy it would be to legally rob Sienna blind. You told me you had a brilliant legal strategy. You explicitly promised me a massive mansion and a massive trust fund. You are just incredibly stupid, Jason. You proudly signed those divorce papers. You eagerly signed that hospital paternity form today. You did all of this to yourself because your massive ego could not handle being married to a woman who was infinitely smarter and far more successful than you will ever be." Jason grabbed a massive glass vase filled with white orchids from the nearest decorative table and violently hurled it onto the marble floor. The heavy glass shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces, sending water and expensive flowers flying everywhere. Several high society guests sitting in the front rows gasped loudly and quickly stood up, physically backing away from his terrifying and completely unhinged temper tantrum. "I owe her $55,000. Jason screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he aggressively pointed at me. "I have absolutely zero assets. My bank account is completely empty, And now I legally owe aggressive collection agencies $400,000 because I claimed your miserable children. How am I supposed to pay for any of this? I am going to federal prison because of you. I absolutely hate you. I wish I had absolutely never met you. The 200 elite guests watched the spectacular implosion of their pathetic romance in absolute disgust. Nobody stepped forward to intervene. Nobody offered a single word of comfort. Instead, I saw dozens of expensive smartphones raised high in the air, recording every single humiliating second of Jason's massively public breakdown. Influential venture capitalists, powerful hospital board members, and prominent community leaders were capturing his complete mental and financial collapse on crystal-clear video. By tomorrow morning, this aggressive screaming match would be circulating through every single corporate office and high society country club in the entire state. Jason was permanently destroying whatever tiny shred of professional dignity he had left. Brittany looked around at the sea of aggressively recording phones, realizing that her pristine reputation was equally destroyed. She let out a highly frustrated shriek, completely overwhelmed by the terrifying reality that she could never comfortably show her face in wealthy circles ever again. Jason wildly continued to scream rapidly, pacing back and forth across the highly beautiful floral altar, aggressively kicking the violently shattered glass and ruined orchids across the massive white marble floor. He was a completely broken, pathetic man, entirely consumed by his own toxic greed and arrogance. As Jason continued his pathetic display of shattered ego, my parents slowly turned their attention away from the humiliating spectacle and looked directly at me. The horrifying reality of the situation had finally pierced through their thick layers of absolute denial. Their precious golden child, the daughter they had fiercely protected and prioritized for my entire life, was completely and utterly ruined. She was not going to be the wealthy mistress of a Silicon Valley estate. She was an unemployed, socially exiled fraud, drowning in $500,000 of inescapable medical and credit card debt. And the man she had manipulated into providing for her was now equally bankrupt and facing federal prosecution. They realized in real time that Brittany was going to lose absolutely everything, and they were completely powerless to stop it on their own. My mother Diane was the first one to move. She cautiously stepped over the shattered glass and ruined white orchids scattered across the marble floor. Her expensive designer gown dragged through the spilled water, but she did not even seem to notice. She walked right up to the altar where I was casually leaning against the wooden podium, her face, which had been twisted with pure hatred toward me just an hour ago, suddenly softened into a deeply pathetic mask of maternal desperation. Her eyes welled up with fresh tears, completely different from the angry tears she had shed earlier. These were the tears of a woman who knew she was staring at her only possible salvation. Sienna. My mother began, her voice trembling with heavy emotion as she reached out to gently touch my arm. I smoothly stepped back completely, refusing to let her make physical contact with me. She awkwardly dropped her hand, swallowing hard before trying again. Sienna, you have to do something to fix this terrible mess. You heard what your lawyer just said? Brittany owes $400,000 to aggressive collection agencies. They will ruin her entire life. They will garnish her wages. They will take her belongings, and she will have absolutely nowhere to live. You have millions of dollars sitting safely in your accounts. You could easily write a single check right now and make all of this horrible debt completely disappear. My father, Richard, quickly hurried over to stand right beside my mother, nodding his head in aggressive agreement. He aggressively rubbed his hands together, trying to put on his best, authoritative, fatherly voice, though it sounded incredibly weak and desperate. Listen to your mother, Sienna. My father pleaded, trying to force a reassuring smile. We know that Jason acted like a complete monster today. We completely agree with you on that fact now. But you cannot possibly let your innocent sister suffer the devastating consequences of his terrible mistakes. She was just highly confused and deeply manipulated by him. You have to be the bigger person here today. Show everyone in this room what a generous and forgiving woman you truly are. I stared at the two of them in absolute disbelief. The sheer magnitude of their blinding hypocrisy was genuinely breathtaking. Just 20 minutes ago, they were aggressively demanding that I surrender my entire $8 million company to reward Brittany for completely destroying my marriage. They had proudly cheered for Jason when he humiliated me. Now that the tables had violently turned, they wanted me to happily open my wallet and completely bail out the exact same woman who had gleefully plotted my ultimate downfall. "You want me to pay off her massive debts?" I asked quietly, making sure my voice carried clearly over the lingering murmurs of the wealthy guests. "Yes," Diane cried out eagerly, sensing a false glimmer of hope. "Please, Sienna. If not for Brittany, then do it for the babies. Those two precious infants are completely innocent. They are your beautiful niece and nephew. They desperately need a warm home, fresh clothes, and a stable environment. They cannot grow up in absolute poverty with collection agencies constantly harassing their mother. You have built such an incredible healthcare company. You have more money than you could ever spend. Paying off $400,000 is absolutely nothing to you. Just pay the debt, buy them a small starter house, and we can all quietly put this incredibly ugly misunderstanding behind us. We can go back to being a normal, loving family again." She continued, desperately stepping closer again. "Your father and I are getting older. We cannot afford to financially support her, and two brand new babies on our retirement income alone. We would lose our own house. You are the only one with the resources to save us all. Please, Sienna, just write the check today and permanently save your true family from total absolute destruction." I looked from my weeping mother to my desperately pleading father, letting the sheer audacity of their request hang in the silent air. "You want me to permanently save your true family from total absolute destruction?" I repeated softly, tasting the bitter irony of those exact words. "You genuinely believe that the two of you and Brittany currently constitute my true family? After you just stood on this very altar and loudly cheered for a man who publicly humiliated me? After you aggressively demanded I step down from my own company to financially reward the woman who slept with my husband? You do not want a loving daughter today. You just want a convenient human shield to quickly absorb the massive financial blow of your own terrible parenting." I stepped forward, completely closing the physical distance between us so they could clearly see the absolute zero emotion in my cold eyes. "I am not writing a single check today," I stated firmly, my voice steady and completely unwavering. "I am entirely done being the automated teller machine for this incredibly toxic family. For the last 15 years, I have quietly funded every single major mistake your precious golden child ever made. When she failed out of college, I paid the severe penalty fees. When she recklessly crashed her luxury car, you forcefully demanded I empty my personal savings to quickly replace it. You always called her highly sensitive and deeply delicate, claiming she desperately needed extra emotional support, while completely ignoring the undeniable fact that I was working 80-hour weeks to build a legitimate corporate empire from absolute nothing. You eagerly used my massive financial success as your personal safety net, while simultaneously punishing me for the very ambition that funded your lavish lifestyle. You constantly called me a cold, unfeeling corporate robot. You loudly told our wealthy relatives I was far too obsessed with money to ever be a good wife. And yet the very first time your precious Brittany actually faces the severe real-world consequences of her own horrific greedy actions, you come crawling right back to the cold corporate robot, aggressively begging for a massive financial bailout. My mother. Diane gasped loudly, clutching her expensive diamond necklace defensively. "We are your parents," she cried out indignantly, her fake sympathetic act immediately dropping. "We raised you. We provided for you. You owe us your absolute respect and your generous financial support in times of severe family crisis." I shook my head slowly, a dark, humorless smile crossing my face. "I successfully paid off whatever ridiculous debt I owed you for raising me a very long time ago," I replied smoothly. "In fact, I have been actively keeping a massive roof over your incredibly ungrateful heads for the last 4 straight years." My father. Richard frowned deeply, total absolute confusion washing over his bright red face. What on earth are you talking about, Sienna? He demanded aggressively. We own our house. We have comfortably lived in that massive colonial estate for over 20 years. We never asked you for a single dime to help pay for our own home. You never asked, because you were entirely too proud and completely oblivious to your own impending financial ruin, I corrected him sharply. 4 years ago, you heavily mortgaged that massive estate to secretly fund Brittany's lavish lifestyle and those incredibly expensive South American cosmetic surgeries she desperately wanted. When you rapidly defaulted on those massive loan payments and the bank aggressively threatened to foreclose on your precious country club home, I quietly stepped in without telling you. I legally arranged for my corporate trust fund to anonymously cover your massive monthly mortgage payments every single month, so you would not suffer the extreme public humiliation of losing your wealthy social status. Richard and Diane turned deathly pale, staring at me in absolute sheer horror, as the terrifying reality of their fragile financial situation violently crashed down around them. But do not worry about my financial interference anymore. I continued relentlessly, thoroughly enjoying the complete destruction of their arrogant pride. Because the exact moment Jason loudly demanded a divorce today, I quietly pulled out my phone and sent a highly specific email to my wealth manager. I officially canceled the automatic mortgage payments, permanently severing all financial ties completely. Your next massive bank payment is officially due in exactly 3 days, and I know for an absolute proven fact that your retirement accounts are completely empty. My mother let out a loud, terrifying wail, physically collapsing against my father, as her entire wealthy world completely evaporated into thin air. You have absolutely no daughter anymore, I declared loudly, my voice echoing like thunder across the beautiful botanical garden venue. I am officially done. You are completely on your own. My father's mouth hung open and my mother was reduced to a sobbing, hyperventilating mess on the marble floor. I turned my back to them, entirely indifferent to their massive emotional breakdown. I had spent my entire life starving for their affection, desperate for just a fraction of the praise they so easily showered on my manipulative stepsister. But looking at them now, reduced to begging for a financial bailout, because their golden child was a massive failure, I felt nothing. No guilt, no sadness. Only the profound, icy satisfaction of setting an unbreakable boundary. I smoothed out the front of my custom silk gown and slowly turned my attention back to the wider room, where the true social execution was already aggressively underway. The 200 elite guests were no longer just a passive audience to my dramatic family conflict. They were actively participating in the complete social annihilation of Jason and Brittany. The tense murmurs had evolved into open aggressive hostility. Dozens of smartphones were still held high in the air, capturing every single pathetic detail of Jason's violent temper tantrum and Brittany's exposed financial fraud. In the highly exclusive, incredibly insular world of Silicon Valley high society, reputation is absolutely everything. Trust is the ultimate currency, and both of them were currently completely bankrupt. I watched as a prominent venture capitalist, a man who had aggressively pursued me to invest in my healthcare tech startup for months, leaned over and whispered something to his wife. She looked at Brittany with a deeply disgusted sneer, entirely pulling her designer purse closer to her body, as if Brittany's catastrophic debt was a highly contagious physical disease. A few tables away, a group of influential hospital board members were aggressively shaking their heads in absolute disbelief, silently agreeing that Jason was a complete corporate liability. They were becoming massive social pariahs in real time, entirely exiled from the wealthy circles they had so desperately tried to manipulate their way into. Jason was still pacing aggressively near the shattered orchid vase, completely ignoring the massive damage he had just done to his own professional image. He aggressively rubbed his hands over his face, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to figure a way out of his inescapable trap. Suddenly, a sharp, loud notification chime cut through the tense atmosphere. It came directly from Jason's tuxedo pocket. He froze, his frantic pacing coming to a sudden halt. He reached into his pocket with violently trembling hands and pulled out his smartphone. He stared at the glowing screen for a long, agonizing second. The remaining color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He looked up, his wide, panicked eyes frantically scanning the crowded botanical garden venue until he found exactly who he was looking for. Sitting at a table near the center of the room was Richard Vance, the senior managing partner of the mid-level consulting firm where Jason was currently employed. Richard was an incredibly stern, highly traditional businessman who valued absolute corporate integrity above all else. He was currently staring directly at Jason, his smartphone held firmly in his hand, a look of pure, unadulterated professional disgust etched deeply onto his face. Richard did not look away when Jason made terrified eye contact. He simply gave a single highly dismissive nod, actively confirming the devastating message he had just sent. Jason let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp, completely dropping his phone onto the marble floor. It clattered loudly, the screen cracking instantly upon impact. DeAndre smoothly walked over and picked up the shattered phone, his eyes quickly scanning the glowing text message. He let out a harsh, booming laugh that echoed violently across the silent room. "Well, Jason, it looks like your incredibly terrible day just got significantly worse," DeAndre announced loudly, thoroughly enjoying the spectacular corporate execution. For those of you who cannot see the screen, Jason's boss, Richard Vance, just sent him a highly direct text message. It reads, "Your employment at this firm is terminated immediately. Clean out your desk by noon tomorrow. We do not employ corporate embezzlers or men who publicly humiliate their highly successful wives. Do not ever contact this firm again." The wealthy crowd let out a massive, highly approving cheer. Jason staggered backward, physically reeling from the devastating blow. He was officially completely unemployed. He had zero income to pay the $55,000 he legally owed my company. He had absolutely no way to pay the $400,000 of debt he had just legally adopted from his manipulative mistress. His professional reputation was entirely destroyed in front of the most influential corporate leaders in the entire state. No reputable firm in Silicon Valley would ever hire a man who had been publicly fired for aggressive corporate embezzlement and profound personal stupidity. He was completely irrevocably ruined, and he had absolutely nobody to blame but his own massive ego. The crushing reality of his sudden unemployment finally pushed Jason past his breaking point. The smartphone slipped completely from his numb fingers and bounced against the cold marble floor. He had nothing left, no job to provide an income, no wealthy wife to endlessly leech off of, no luxury mansion to hide in. He was staring at a towering mountain of federal embezzlement charges and catastrophic medical debt, with absolutely zero financial resources to fight back. His shoulders slumped forward, and the last remaining shreds of his arrogant pride violently evaporated. He slowly turned his head away from the shattered smartphone and looked directly at me. His eyes were wide with a pathetic, desperate terror that I had never seen before. Without a single word of warning, Jason suddenly lunged forward toward the wooden podium. He did not yell or act aggressively this time. Instead, his knees violently buckled the second he reached me, and he collapsed heavily onto the marble floor right at my feet. The wealthy crowd collectively gasped, stepping even further back from the humiliating spectacle. Jason reached out with trembling hands and desperately grabbed the delicate silk fabric of my custom wedding gown. "Sienna, please." Jason openly sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically across the silent botanical garden. "Please, you have to listen to me. I was completely out of my mind. I did not mean any of the terrible things I just said to you. Brittany completely manipulated me into doing this. She preyed on my insecurities and constantly fed me horrible lies about you. I was just so confused and stressed about my career. You know I love you. We have been legally married for 3 years. We built a beautiful life together. You cannot just throw all of that away over one stupid mistake." He frantically reached into his tuxedo jacket and yanked out the heavily crumpled divorce papers I had calmly signed earlier. He held them up toward me, his hands shaking so violently the cheap paper loudly rustled. "We can just rip these up right now," Jason begged desperately, aggressively trying to push the documents into my hands. "We can completely pretend tonight never even happened." I will send Brittany away forever. I will formally renounce those twins. I will never speak to her or her horrible children again. Just please tear these papers up, Sienna. Forgive me, I am begging you to save my life. I looked down at the pathetic weeping man clutching my silk dress. He was perfectly willing to instantly abandon his supposed true soulmate and completely disown his own biological children the exact second they became a financial liability. His profound cowardice was genuinely nauseating. I slowly reached down and firmly grabbed his wrists, aggressively peeling his sweating hands off my expensive gown. I am not tearing up anything, I replied coldly, my voice ringing with absolute finality. Do you honestly think I would ever let you back into my life after you proudly paraded your mistress in front of 200 of my closest colleagues and investors? You stood on this exact altar and confidently demanded your legal freedom. You loudly declared that I was a cold corporate robot who could never give you a real family. You shoved those incredibly cheap divorce papers in my face and arrogantly demanded I sign them so you could immediately claim your new heirs. I simply gave you exactly what you aggressively asked for, Jason. You wanted your total freedom, and now you finally have it. But we have not filed them yet. Jason frantically argued, tears streaming aggressively down his flushed face. As long as we do not formally submit them to the family court judge, they are legally meaningless. We can just easily throw them in the trash. Please, Sienna. I have absolutely nothing left. DeAndre stepped forward, a highly amused smirk playing on his face. He smoothly pulled his silver tablet from his leather briefcase and tapped the glowing screen. You really need to strongly consider taking a basic introductory law class, Jason DeAndre mocked loudly. You see, the exact moment Sienna gracefully signed those documents, I immediately scanned them, using my secure legal application. I electronically submitted the fully executed divorce petition directly to the county courthouse portal exactly 20 minutes ago. It is already time-stamped, processed, and actively sitting in a highly expedited judicial queue. Tearing up those physical pieces of paper will accomplish absolutely nothing. The trap was completely inescapable. The divorce was officially locked into the legal system, and there was absolutely no way to reverse the catastrophic damage. Jason stared at DeAndre in pure, unadulterated horror, realizing that his absolute final desperate escape route had been permanently sealed shut long before he even knew he needed it. He was officially trapped. Jason stared up at DeAndre with hollow, lifeless eyes. The realization that his divorce was already officially processing through the county courthouse completely drained the last ounce of fight from his pathetic body. He lowered his head, staring at the ruined orchids scattered across the marble floor. He had absolutely nothing left to say. There were no more arrogant threats to make. There were no more manipulative lies that could save him from the catastrophic mess he had created. The entire botanical garden venue remained incredibly quiet. The wealthy guests simply watched him silently, waiting to see if he would finally gather whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left and quietly walk out the back doors. But the evening was not quite over yet. Just when Jason honestly thought his public humiliation had reached its absolute peak, a new figure slowly emerged from the silent crowd. Sitting in the very front row for the entire agonizing hour was the mother of Jason, named Patricia. Unlike my incredibly loud and aggressively demanding parents, Patricia had not spoken a single word since Brittany first walked through those heavy oak doors. She had simply sat there perfectly still, her face drained of all color, her hands tightly clutched in her lap. I had briefly noticed her intense reaction earlier, but I had assumed she was simply deeply embarrassed by the horrific public behavior of her son. I was entirely wrong. Patricia was not just embarrassed. She was horrified by a devastating truth that nobody else in the room could comprehend yet. Patricia slowly stood up from her velvet chair. She was a deeply traditional woman who fiercely valued her pristine family image above absolutely everything else. She meticulously planned her outfits, carefully curated her social circle, and always demanded absolute perfection from her children. Seeing her son groveling on the floor like a pathetic beggar was undoubtedly the worst moment of her entire life. But as she slowly walked up the steps toward the beautiful floral altar, she did not even look at Jason. Her piercing gaze was entirely locked onto Brittany and the two sleeping infants wrapped in pale yellow hospital blankets. The elite guests parted slightly, giving the older woman plenty of space as she purposefully marched toward the center of the stage. Her high heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, echoing loudly in the tense silence. Jason heard the familiar footsteps and slowly raised his head. He looked at his mother with a sudden, desperate glimmer of hope flashing in his terrified eyes. He genuinely thought Patricia was coming to his rescue. He thought his wealthy mother was going to aggressively defend him, perhaps offer to pay off the massive corporate embezzlement debt, or fiercely yell at me for being so incredibly cruel to her beloved son. "Mom," Jason whispered weakly, reaching a trembling hand out toward her. "Please help me. She set me up. Sienna and DeAndre completely trapped me." Patricia ignored his outstretched hand. She walked right past her weeping son, without so much as a single sympathetic glance. She stopped directly in front of Brittany, standing uncomfortably close to the younger woman. Brittany instinctively took a nervous step backward, her eyes darting frantically around the room as she desperately tried to maintain her grip on the newborn twins. She tried to force a polite smile, completely unsure of how to interact with the stern woman who was supposed to be her brand-new mother-in-law. Patricia did not smile back. She leaned forward, her eyes aggressively scanning the tiny faces of the sleeping babies. She studied their features with a cold scrutiny that made Brittany visibly tremble. After a long, agonizing moment, Patricia slowly stood back up and looked directly into the highly panicked eyes of Brittany. The look on the face of Patricia was not just simple anger. It was pure, unadulterated, absolute disgust. It was the deeply terrifying look of a highly protective mother who had just caught a vicious predator sneaking into her home. "You thought you were so incredibly clever," Patricia whispered, her voice dangerously low, but carrying clearly across the silent altar. "You thought you could just dress up in a cheap white gown, parade these poor, innocent children in front of 200 people, and effortlessly steal my family wealth. You honestly thought my son was stupid enough to blindly accept this horrific lie." Brittany swallowed hard, clutching the babies even tighter. "I do not know what you are talking about," Brittany stammered defensively. "These are his beautiful children. We are starting a real family together." Patricia let out a harsh, bitter scoff that sounded like a cracking whip. She slowly turned her head and finally looked down at Jason, who was still kneeling pathetically on the floor. The cold marble floor directly in front of her. He looked up, fully expecting his wealthy mother to violently defend him against the cruel world. He expected her to gently stroke his hair and reassure him. He expected her to fix the catastrophic mess he created. But Patricia did absolutely none of those things. Instead, Patricia took one deliberate step closer to him. She raised her right hand high into the air and brought it down across his face with a sickeningly loud crack. The stinging slap echoed violently across the dead, silent botanical garden venue. The sheer force knocked Jason sideways. He sprawled awkwardly onto the marble floor amidst the shattered glass he had destroyed earlier. He gasped loudly, his hand flying up to cover his rapidly reddening cheek. The 200 elite guests let out a massive collective gasp of absolute shock. My own parents, Richard and Diane, visibly recoiled in horror. Nobody had ever seen the perfectly composed, highly traditional Patricia lose her temper like this. She prided herself on flawless emotional control. Seeing her strike her son in public was unprecedented. Jason stared up at his mother in pure, unadulterated terror and profound confusion. "Mom," he whimpered pathetically, his voice cracking with raw emotional pain. "Why would you do that? I am your son. I need your help." Patricia stood over him, trembling with an intense rage. She leaned down incredibly close to his face. The microphone on the floor picked up every single word of her horrified, trembling whisper. The sound was instantly broadcast through the massive speakers, echoing clearly across the entire glass venue for every single person to hear. You absolute idiot, Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying mixture of deep disgust and profound sorrow. You threw away a brilliant, wealthy wife and completely destroyed your entire professional life for this greedy woman and her children. Jason aggressively nodded his head, tears streaming down his face. Yes, he cried out defensively. I did it for my children. I did it because I finally wanted to be a real father to my own biological heirs. Patricia closed her eyes for a brief second, shaking her head as if she was trying to physically reject the sheer magnitude of his absolute stupidity. When she opened her eyes again, they were completely devoid of any maternal warmth. She looked at him with absolute pity. She did not tell you. Patricia whispered loudly into the microphone, her words cutting through the tense air like a sharply honed blade. She did not tell you the truth about those babies. Jason froze, his hand slowly dropping from his stinging red cheek. He looked completely bewildered. What truth? Jason stammered frantically, his panicked eyes darting wildly between his furious mother and the terrified woman standing just a few feet away. Brittany told me everything. We have been secretly together for 8 straight months. I was there the exact day she discovered she was pregnant. They are my beautiful children. I signed the official hospital paternity forms today. I legally claimed them as my own flesh and blood. Patricia let out a harsh, suffocated sob that sounded completely devoid of any actual sadness. It was a sob of pure psychological devastation. You claimed them, she repeated mockingly, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at Brittany. You boldly stood on this beautiful altar and proudly claimed children that could not possibly belong to you. You aggressively signed legally binding state documents, adopting $400,000 of catastrophic debt for a woman who has been aggressively lying to your face since the very first day you met her. Brittany took another panicked step backward, completely terrified of the older woman. Please just stop talking, Brittany begged loudly, her voice shrill and desperate. You are just trying to aggressively confuse him. You are trying to ruin our beautiful family. But Patricia completely ignored the desperate pleas of the manipulative mistress. She kept her intense, furious gaze locked firmly on Jason. You are genuinely the most gullible fool I have ever known, Patricia declared, her voice rising steadily in volume until it commanded the absolute attention of the entire room. You blindly destroyed your entire life for a biological impossibility. He stared at her blankly, completely, unable to process the heavy words she was speaking. A biological impossibility, he repeated slowly, as if the concept was entirely foreign to his panicking mind. What are you talking about? I saw the ultrasound scans with my own eyes. I held them in the hospital this morning. Patricia took a deep breath, preparing to permanently shatter his completely fabricated reality in front of absolutely everyone standing here tonight. Patricia reached out and firmly pulled the microphone from the wooden podium. The harsh screech of the feedback echoed briefly, but she did not flinch. She stood incredibly tall, her shoulders squared, channeling the formidable matriarchal authority she had ruthlessly maintained for decades. She looked directly down at her weeping son on the marble floor. When you were 15 years old, Patricia began, her voice echoing with a haunting clarity across the silent botanical garden. You came home from summer camp with a terrible fever. We initially thought it was just a severe flu, but your temperature kept dangerously rising and your throat swelled so heavily you could barely swallow water. We rushed you to the emergency room in the middle of the night. The doctors quickly diagnosed you with a highly aggressive strain of the mumps. You were completely delirious for 3 straight days. You probably do not remember the worst parts of that terrifying hospital stay, Jason. But I remember absolutely every single agonizing second of it. Jason stared up at her, entirely lost. He clearly remembered getting incredibly sick as a teenager, but he had absolutely no idea how a childhood illness connected to the horrifying disaster currently unfolding on my wedding altar. I recovered from that, Jason argued weakly, his voice trembling with sheer desperation. It was just a stupid childhood virus. I was completely fine after a few weeks. Patricia shook her head slowly, her eyes reflecting a profound, crushing sorrow. "You recovered from the fever," Patricia corrected sharply. "But the viral infection violently spread. It aggressively attacked your reproductive system. You developed a highly severe, catastrophic case of mumps orchitis. The swelling and internal tissue damage were so incredibly extensive that the pediatric specialists were highly concerned about your long-term physical development. After your fever finally broke and you were officially discharged, the head specialist pulled me and your father into a private consultation room to discuss your future. They ran several comprehensive tests over the following 6 months to carefully monitor your healing process." Patricia paused, letting the heavy, terrifying medical terminology aggressively sink into the incredibly tense atmosphere of the beautiful glass venue. The 200 wealthy guests leaned forward in their velvet chairs, completely captivated by the horrifying family secret being brutally dragged into the bright chandelier light. Brittany began to violently shake, aggressively backing away from the altar until her back hit the solid glass wall of the venue. She clutched the newborn twins so tightly they began to softly cry, but the ambient noise was entirely drowned out by the commanding voice of Patricia. "The medical specialist sat me down and explicitly told me the devastating test results." Patricia continued loudly, ensuring her voice reached the very back row of the stunned crowd. "The severe viral infection had completely permanently destroyed your reproductive capabilities. The internal cellular damage was entirely irreversible. You were formally diagnosed with a condition called non-obstructive azoospermia. There is absolutely zero sperm production. The doctors explicitly told me that you would never ever be able to naturally conceive a child. I was absolutely devastated for you. You were only a young teenage boy playing high school sports, completely obsessed with your arrogant pride. I actively made the highly difficult parental decision to fiercely protect your fragile ego. I quietly decided I would personally tell you the painful truth when you were finally a mature adult, ready to actively start trying for a real family. But you never actually wanted children with Sienna," Patricia stated coldly, her voice dropping to a terrifying lethal register. "You were perfectly content aggressively leeching off her massive corporate success, so I kept my mouth entirely shut to permanently protect your massive pride. And this is exactly how you repay my lifelong maternal protection. You publicly humiliate a highly successful, brilliant woman on her beautiful wedding day. You aggressively embezzle tens of thousands of corporate dollars to buy Cartier diamonds for a cheap fraud. And you proudly claim fatherhood over 2 infants you could not possibly have created." Patricia took one final aggressive step forward, pointing her finger directly at the 2 yellow hospital blankets in the trembling arms of Brittany. "I want every single person in this venue to hear me right now," Patricia announced to the dead silent room, delivering the ultimate catastrophic payoff. "Jason is 100% sterile. He has absolute undeniable azoospermia. It is medically impossible for him to father children. Those newborn twins do not share a single drop of our family blood." Brittany aggressively targeted a completely sterile man, eagerly went to a sperm bank or slept with another man, and viciously framed my deeply stupid son to steal exactly $4 million. This entirely destroys your pathetic, totally fake new family. The crushing weight of Patricia's declaration slammed into Jason like a runaway freight train. He remained entirely frozen on the marble floor, his mind desperately scrambling to process the devastating reality of his mother's words. Azoospermia. Medically impossible. Biologically sterile. The heavy medical terms bounced around his panicking brain until the horrifying truth finally clicked into place. He slowly turned his head to look at Brittany. The beautiful, delicate woman he had proudly championed as his ultimate soulmate was suddenly looking back at him with the terrified, cornered expression of a trapped animal. She was not a loving partner who had accidentally gotten pregnant during a passionate secret romance. She was a highly calculated, incredibly ruthless predator. She had deliberately sought out the gullible husband of a wealthy healthcare tech chief executive officer. When she desperately needed a massive financial bailout to quickly erase her catastrophic $400,000 of debt, she had aggressively executed a flawless trap. Whether she had secretly visited a local sperm bank or simply slept with another random man, she had purposely timed her completely fabricated pregnancy to heavily manipulate Jason. She knew his massive ego was his absolute weakest point. She knew he desperately wanted to feel like a powerful, dominant patriarch because he constantly felt inferior to my corporate success. So she simply handed him another man's children and aggressively convinced him he was the proud biological father. And Jason had eagerly swallowed every single poisonous drop of her massive lie. He had confidently thrown away his entire marriage, publicly humiliated his wealthy wife, and permanently destroyed his professional consulting career, all to proudly claim a fake biological legacy. Jason let out a wretched, suffocating gasp. "You completely used me," Jason whispered, his voice vibrating with absolute, unadulterated horror. "You knew I was married to a millionaire. You knew I had direct legal access to her massive fortune. You purposely let me burn my entire life to the ground just so I could blindly pay for your botched surgeries and another man's babies." Brittany did not even try to aggressively deny it this time. The absolute truth was completely exposed under the bright chandelier light, and her pristine victim mask had permanently shattered. She aggressively gripped the newborn twins, her face twisting into an ugly, bitter scowl. "You were an incredibly easy target," Jason Brittany hissed coldly, her true venomous nature finally on full display for the wealthy crowd. "You were so incredibly desperate to feel important. You literally begged me to let you be the hero. All I had to do was show you a positive pregnancy test and stroke your pathetic ego. You aggressively did all the heavy lifting yourself. You were the one who proudly marched into this venue and loudly demanded the divorce. You were the one who aggressively shoved those legal papers in her face. I just sat back and watched you eagerly dig your own massive grave." Jason let out a harrowing, agonizing scream of pure psychological defeat. He aggressively grabbed his own hair, rocking back and forth on the shattered glass. He was completely broken. He had absolutely nothing left. But the catastrophic nightmare was still not entirely over. DeAndre smoothly walked over to the weeping man, his tailored suit perfectly pristine amidst the absolute chaos of the ruined wedding reception. DeAndre looked down at Jason with a chilling, ruthless smile that promised absolute legal destruction. "I really hope you fully understand the incredible irony of your current situation," Jason DeAndre announced loudly, ensuring every single elite guest heard the final devastating legal blow. "Because your mother just explicitly confirmed that you are completely biologically sterile. You have absolutely no genetic connection to those two infants. But as a highly experienced corporate lawyer, I must strongly remind you that the family court system does not actually care about your biology tonight. The court only cares about the highly official state documents you voluntarily signed." DeAndre pulled the pink hospital form back out of his jacket pocket and casually dropped it onto the marble floor right in front of Jason. "You arrogantly rushed to sign this voluntary paternity acknowledgement form today, simply to aggressively spite Sienna," DeAndre explained with surgical precision. "By legally claiming these twins, you officially waived your right to a genetic test. You legally established yourself as their permanent father. So even though you are completely sterile, you are now legally and financially bound to another man's children for the next 18 years. You are permanently tied to a manipulative fraud who utterly despises you. You owe exactly $400,000 in debt, plus the $55,000 you actively embezzled from my client. You very eagerly tried to destroy Sienna today, but you only successfully managed to completely annihilate yourself entirely." The final echo of the devastating legal summary delivered by DeAndre hung heavily in the air. It was a permanent death sentence for the pathetic man currently kneeling in the ruined orchids. Jason did not even attempt to formulate a single defensive response. He simply curled inward, burying his flushed face into his trembling hands as violent, wretched sobs aggressively racked his entire body. He was completely defeated and utterly destroyed by his own monumental arrogance. But while Jason was entirely paralyzed by his newfound financial prison, Brittany was actively consumed by a frantic and highly desperate self-preserving panic. She wildly looked around the beautiful botanical garden venue, her wide eyes darting rapidly from the weeping man on the floor to the incredibly hostile faces of the 200 elite guests. There was no massive trust fund waiting for her anywhere. There was no luxury Silicon Valley estate to proudly claim. There was only a completely broke, unemployed, sterile man and $500,000 of inescapable personal debt. Her carefully constructed fantasy world had completely collapsed, and her raw survival instinct finally kicked into high gear. She desperately needed to quickly escape this absolute nightmare immediately right now. Gripping the two crying infants tightly against her chest, Brittany abruptly spun around and desperately bolted toward the heavy oak doors located at the very back of the venue. She completely abandoned any lingering pretense of grace or dignity. She simply wanted to run far away from the glaring judgment of the wealthy crowd. But she had entirely forgotten about the massive stolen designer wedding dress she was currently wearing. As she frantically sprinted down the long white aisle, the thick layers of heavy white lace and trailing silk violently tangled tightly around her expensive designer high heels very suddenly. She let out a sharp, terrified shriek as her feet were forcefully yanked right out from under her. She crashed heavily onto the pristine white aisle runner. She instinctively twisted her body at the very last second, ensuring the newborn twins landed safely on top of her, but the sheer physical impact of the heavy fall knocked the wind completely out of her burning lungs. The babies immediately began screaming at the absolute top of their tiny lungs, deeply startled by the sudden violent drop. Brittany scrambled frantically on the floor, her expensive fake wedding dress heavily ripped fully open. The fabric was heavily stained with dirt, making her completely resemble a desperate, cornered rat, aggressively trying to claw its way out of a heavy steel trap. She struggled to push herself back up, but her high heel was entirely stuck in the torn lace fabric. Nobody rushed forward to help her today. Not a single person in the massive room extended a hand to quickly assist the manipulative fraud struggling helplessly on the floor. Instead, a low wave of mocking laughter began to rapidly ripple through the extremely wealthy crowd, sitting comfortably in their velvet chairs observing her tonight. The highly influential venture capitalists, the prominent hospital board members, and the high society socialites openly pointed at the spectacular wreckage of her highly dramatic exit. The hushed whispers completely vanished quickly, replaced by aggressive, loudly audible jeers. They were actively laughing at her pathetic downfall, thoroughly enjoying the brutal karma she so richly deserved. Standing just a few feet away from the beautiful floral altar, my parents Richard and Diane were completely frozen in absolute horror. The mocking laughter of the elite guests hit them like forceful physical blows directly to the face. They were completely paralyzed and ruined. They had spent their entire adult lives desperately climbing the highly exclusive social ladder of Silicon Valley. They had heavily mortgaged their actual home just to proudly maintain the superficial illusion of immense wealth. They had eagerly sacrificed my emotional well-being for decades simply to strictly protect their pristine family image. And now they were being loudly mocked by the exact same powerful people they had spent long years trying to deeply impress. Diane pressed her trembling hands against her pale cheeks, her eyes darting frantically as she finally realized their total social execution was absolute and entirely inescapable today. The wealthy women she regularly played tennis with at the country club were currently recording her massive public humiliation on their smart devices. Richard stared blankly at his utterly disgraced golden child, thrashing helplessly on the aisle runner, his shoulders slumped in total absolute defeat. They were entirely ruined. Their deeply toxic favoritism had finally blown up perfectly in their arrogant faces. They had actively bet their entire financial future and social standing on a manipulative thief, and they had permanently lost absolutely everything. Jason continued to aggressively weep on the cold marble floor, completely ignoring the chaotic scene. Beautiful. I did not feel the need to gloat or yell. The spectacular devastation unfolding across the botanical garden was entirely self-inflicted, and my active participation was no longer required. I gracefully turned my attention away from the pathetic display of shattered egos and picked up my crystal flute of vintage champagne from the wooden podium. DeAndre stood perfectly still beside me, surveying the absolute wreckage of my cheating husband with a highly satisfied professional smirk. I raised my glass toward him in a silent gesture of profound gratitude. He smoothly lifted his own glass from the nearby table, meeting my crystal flute in the air. The delicate chime of the expensive glass clinking together rang like a crystal-clear bell over the chaotic sounds of the ruined wedding reception. It was the perfect sound of absolute victory. "Thank you for your exceptional legal counsel tonight," I said quietly to him, my voice completely steady and entirely devoid of any lingering stress. He simply nodded his head, his dark eyes gleaming with ruthless triumph. "It was my absolute pleasure," Sienna DeAndre replied smoothly. "Enjoy your brand new freedom. I took one final slow sip of the expensive champagne, letting the crisp liquid wash down my throat before casually setting the crystal flute back down onto the podium. I did not bother looking down at Jason again. He was still aggressively weeping on the cold marble floor, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of his $500,000 in inescapable debt and impending federal embezzlement charges. He was entirely pathetic, and he was permanently out of my life. I stepped carefully over the violently shattered glass and the ruined white orchids, ensuring my custom silk wedding gown remained perfectly pristine. As I gracefully descended the wooden steps of the beautiful floral altar, the 200 elite guests immediately stopped their mocking laughter. The high society crowd fell into a deeply respectful silence, seamlessly parting like the Red Sea to create a wide, clear path for my grand departure. They looked at me with absolute awe and profound respect. I had just flawlessly executed the most brilliant corporate and personal takedown in Silicon Valley history without shedding a single tear or raising my voice in anger. I walked confidently down the long white aisle with my head held incredibly high. My posture was absolutely perfect, radiating the overwhelming power and untouchable authority of a highly successful chief executive officer who had just successfully purged a massive parasite from her multi-million-dollar empire. I smoothly walked right past my parents, Richard and Diane, who were still standing completely frozen near the front row in absolute humiliation. My mother looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes, silently begging for a final scrap of financial mercy. I did not even break my stride. I looked straight ahead, completely ignoring their toxic existence. They were officially dead to me. A few yards further down the aisle, Brittany was still frantically struggling on the white runner. Her stolen designer wedding dress was completely ripped and heavily stained with dirt. She was aggressively wrestling with the thick lace fabric, frantically trying to free her expensive high heels, while the newborn twins continued to cry loudly in her arms. She looked up at me as I approached, her face twisted in pure, desperate terror. I smoothly sidestepped her pathetic thrashing form, leaving her completely trapped in her own highly destructive web of massive financial fraud. I reached the heavy oak doors at the very back of the glass venue. Two sharply dressed security guards immediately pulled the massive wooden handles holding the heavy doors wide open for my exit. I stepped firmly across the threshold, leaving the chaotic, brightly lit botanical garden and all its pathetic occupants permanently behind me. The heavy doors swung shut with a highly satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the sounds of Jason weeping and Brittany struggling. The sudden, absolute silence of the outer courtyard was incredibly beautiful. I took a deep, refreshing breath of the cool night air. The crisp evening breeze gently rustled the lush green trees, instantly cooling my skin and washing away the suffocating tension of the last hour. My personal chauffeur was already standing perfectly at attention next to my sleek black luxury limousine parked directly at the front curb. He opened the heavy rear door, offering me a highly respectful bow as I approached the expensive vehicle. I gathered the pristine silk fabric of my custom gown and gracefully slid into the spacious, incredibly comfortable leather interior of the waiting car. The chauffeur closed the door securely. The powerful engine quietly roared to life. I leaned back into the soft leather, untouchable, massively wealthy, and finally free. The long black limousine smoothly drove away into the beautiful night. The dramatic downfall of Jason and Brittany perfectly illustrates that unchecked greed and staggering arrogance will inevitably engineer your own destruction. They were so consumed by the desire to effortlessly steal her massive empire that they completely blinded themselves to the glaring flaws in their malicious plan. By underestimating Sienna's intelligence and refusing to read the legal and medical realities of their situation, they built a fragile house of cards that collapsed instantly under scrutiny. Integrity is your strongest shield, while manipulation is a trap you set for yourself. Always protect your boundaries and read the fine print before signing. The story masterfully highlights the satisfaction of a meticulously executed plan over an emotional outburst. Sienna's stoic demeanor provides excellent contrast to the frantic chaos, making the severe consequences for the antagonists feel fully earned and highly engaging to read.